This video will serve as a brief introduction to plant form and function, and we'll essentially focus on some basic concepts of plant anatomy and physiology. Let's begin with just considering a basic plant. Obviously, there's lots of diversity out there, but if you think about a basic plant, they typically consist of an underground portion, of course, the root system, which is there primarily to absorb water and other nutrients within the soil, and the above ground portion, of course, the shoot system, consisting of stems and leaves. There are lots of factors that come into play that regulate or control the overall structure or morphology of plants, but a basic concept I just would like to point out at this time is this idea of apical dominance. And so if you take a look at the shoot system of the plant in this image, you'll of course notice that there are several leaves attached to the main stem here. And if you look closely, where each leaf attaches to the stem, you'll notice an axillary bud. Now those axillary buds have the potential to develop into a new branch, much like we see taking place on the right here. But you will also notice toward the very top of the shoot system, there is this primary apical bud. And it turns out that the apical bud controls or regulates, to some extent, the ability of these axillary buds to grow into new branches. And essentially what happens is that as long as the apical bud is fairly close to any given axillary bud, the apical bud will prevent or inhibit the axillary buds from growing into a new branch. However, once the apical bud gets a certain distance away from any given axillary bud, or if the apical bud is removed, then those axillary buds are free to grow into new branches, again, much like we see toward the right. In a sense, what happens is the apical bud produces hormones. Those hormones make their way down the stem, and those hormones prevent the axillary buds from growing into new branches. So, if the apical bud is removed, the source of hormones is removed, and again, the axillary buds can then grow into new branches. There are some basic concepts related to plant growth, and as we'll see, plants are radically different in terms of growth and development from animals. So just a few basic concepts that we'll mention at this point. First of all, there are specific regions within plants where active cell division takes place. We call these regions meristems, and there are a couple of different types of meristems. First of all, let's mention apical meristems. At the tip of every root and of every shoot, there is an apical meristem. So an apical meristem is just a small cluster of cells, much like we see here toward the left. This is a section through a stem, or toward the right, this is a section through a root. The apical meristem, again, a small cluster of cells where active cell division takes place. Now, when these cells are dividing, they contribute to all the other cells that make up that plant, and they essentially cause an increase in the length, again, either in the shoot or the root system of the plant. So we refer to all of this as primary growth. So primary growth is all of those cells or tissues formed by the activity of apical meristems. In addition, so all plants undergo some primary growth, but in addition, many plants also experience secondary growth. So think of a tree, for example. Yes, there are apical meristems at the tips of the shoots and the root systems, but plants also, especially trees, can grow wider. So think of a tree trunk growing wider year after year after year. That increase in the diameter of a tree trunk it results from the activity of these other meristems we refer to as lateral meristems. So all the activity of lateral meristems produces secondary growth, or typically new woody tissue, of a tree. So for example, if you take a look at this image, we're looking at a section through a very young tree. I've identified this single layer of cells right here. This is the vascular cambium. The vascular cambium is one example of a lateral meristem. So these cambial cells divide, because they're a meristem, they divide by mitosis, and they contribute to new woody tissues as a tree trunk grows wider year after year after year. So we have these apical meristems and these lateral meristems producing new cells on a continual basis. What then are some of the fundamental tissues we can identify within plants? Well, let's first of all mention the epidermis, simply the outermost layer of cells on a plant. Quite often the epidermis is replaced by bark, for example in trees. But the epidermis can often contain very specialized types of cells. Just a few examples. The images that we see here are of stomates, and the stomates are the actual opening or the pores that we find on the surface of leaves. But each stomate is actually surrounded by two guard cells. So guard cells, again, are just an example of a specialized epidermal cell. And the guard cells can essentially contract and relax, thereby controlling whether or not stomates are open much like we see in this lower left-hand image, or closed, depending upon environmental conditions. In addition, trichomes are other examples of specialized epidermal cells. So this top image here is from a stinging nettle. Lower right image is from a leaf of a Venus flytrap. And so the trichomes are these red structures that produce the enzymes that digest insects. And finally, this lower left image is of a leaf surface with lots of trichomes or hair-like structures that essentially minimize loss of water from the surface of that leaf. Finally, as an example of a specialized epidermal cell, we have root hairs. So if you notice this longitudinal section, this is from a root. Root hairs are simply extensions of epidermal cells. So root hairs are literally just individual or single cells, of course providing a tremendous amount of surface area for plants to absorb water from the surrounding soil. In addition to the epidermis, another fundamental type of tissue we identify within plants we simply refer to as the ground tissue. On the left, we see a cross-section through a stem. On the right, a cross-section through a root. Ground tissue is essentially your basic, generic, most fundamental type of cell within plants. So all of these cells we see within the pith region of the stem, that's all part of the ground tissue. And all of these purple cells that we see in the cortex region of this root on the right, again, those are all part of the ground tissue. It turns out that one of the big differences between plant cells and animal cells is, of course, plant cells contain a cell wall. So just a few brief comments about plant cell walls. First of all, plant cells are connected to each other through these structures we refer to as plasmodesmata. So if you look at the image on the right, we see a single large plant cell in the middle and several other adjacent cells surrounding it. But notice that each of those cells is connected by these little openings or these little channels. Again, those are the plasmodesmata. So plasmodesmata are literally holes in the cell walls between adjacent cells. And so now just a few more comments about the basic construction of plant cell walls. So what we see here is just a schematic of a single plant cell. Again, keep in mind that those plasmodesmata are there. I don't have them sketched, but they're present, those openings between adjacent cells. But just wanted to point out that cell walls of plants are actually kind of complex structures. But just to get your bearings, what we're looking at here is, again, a single plant cell, and the innermost region, that represents the cell membrane. So the enzymes that actually produce cell wall material are embedded in the cell membrane. And so all plant cells, at some point, will produce what we call the primary cell wall. So the primary cell wall, I'm going to just label right there. It says outermost layer. So again, all plants produce primary cell wall. But then many plant cells, at some later point in time, will produce a secondary cell wall. And that will be located toward the interior of the primary wall itself. Again, because if you think about it, the primary wall is formed first, and the enzymes that produce cell material are located on cell membranes. If a secondary wall is produced, it will be located interior to the primary wall that's formed initially. Now, I just point this out because, as we'll see next, some cells rely heavily on a very structurally rigid secondary cell wall in order to function properly. And so the third and final tissue system we'll identify is the vascular tissue. So vascular tissue, much like the circulatory system in your body, plants, they also have to transport things throughout their bodies. So they have specialized cells that do just that. So first of all, let's briefly talk about xylem. Xylem represents those cells that are specialized for the transport of water. We typically find one or two different types of xylem cells within plants. So first of all vascular plants produce tracheids. So if you take a block of wood or a piece of lumber, much like you see in this top right-hand image here, if you look at most of the cells in that wood, again, they are going to be xylem. And if their xylem consists largely of tracheids, if you look toward the lower left-hand image, these are elongated, narrow cells. They have very thick, very tough, rigid secondary cell wall. Notice these tracheids tend to be sort of stacked on top of each other vertically through the trunk of a tree. And notice that they have these pits. These pits represent holes in secondary cell wall material that allows water to pass from cell to cell as it makes its way up a tree. So in addition to tracheids, some plants also have vessel elements. that they use for conducting water. Notice that vessel elements tend to be shorter and much wider than tracheids. So if you think about these two types of cells, it turns out vessel elements are much more efficient at conducting water. In other words, they can conduct a whole lot more water than can tracheids. But both, of course, are certainly effective at transporting water through plants. So just to get you another perspective, lower right-hand image here is a block of wood. Notice these much narrow diametered cells, those are tracheids, but we also have a variety of vessel elements there that again provide a fairly wide passageway through which water can move up through the trunk of the tree. So in addition to these xylem cells transporting water, plants also have other specialized vascular tissue cells that are involved in the transport of sugar, typically from the leaves down through the rest of the plant. So the cells that are involved in the transport of sugars throughout the plant are simply referred to as phloem. There are different types of phloem cells, but one of the terms you might come across is a sieve element or a sieve tube element. Again, simply referring to a type of phloem cell. So just to give you some perspective, what we're looking at here is a vascular bundle, this upper right-hand image from a stem of a plant. The cells that are stained red, those are xylem cells, but all these much smaller green cells, those are phloem cells. We often find xylem and phloem located right next to each other. Sieve elements, if you look toward the lower left hand of this image here, sieve elements tend to be stacked on top of each other and again provide living cells through which sugars can be moved, again typically from leaves, down through the rest of the plant. And so now let's very briefly talk about the basic structure and organization of a few plant organs, starting with roots. If you take a look at the image toward the left, we see basically a section through a root. Toward the very bottom, we have a root cap. That's there to help protect the root as it grows its way down through the soil. We also have this apical meristem, which we talked about previously. Of course, that's where active cell division is taking place. The zone of elongation, that's essentially where all the cells that are produced by the apical meristem elongate. And that actually is what pushes the root tip down through the soil. Then, in the more older, mature portion, then we see specific cells and root hairs starting to differentiate, which of course are there to absorb lots of water from the surrounding soil. If you make a cross-section through a root and look at it in a microscope, it looks much like what we see here toward the right. Very highly organized, and so let's briefly talk about some of the cells and tissues found within the interior portion of a root. So if you think about the image you just saw a second ago, I essentially have recreated that as a sketch here. So again, we're looking at a cross-section through a root, just identifying some of the major cell types we find here. So let's begin by simply identifying the epidermis. Again, of course, the epidermis is simply the outermost layer of cells. So there's our epidermis. Notice interior to the epidermis is another fairly well-defined cylinder of cells. Of course, in this image, it's just a ring of cells, but that is the endodermis. Now imagine if this is a root growing through the soil, it's going to be absorbing water, and of course that water somehow eventually has to make its way into the xylem of the root so that it can be transported throughout the rest of the plant. So the xylem of the root tends to be found toward the innermost region of the root, and these are cells. They're often arranged in a lobed-like arrangement. But then between the lobes of xylem cells, that's where we tend to find our phloem cells. So what I just want to point out here again is imagine water making its way into the xylem of this root. Before it can enter the xylem, notice that the water has to pass across the endodermis. And it turns out the endodermis provides some level of control as to what things can get into the xylem system of the plant. And it does have an ability to exclude certain things that the plant might not want in its body. So various pollutants and so forth that might be found in soils, plants can actually exclude them from entering their xylem and being transported throughout the plant tissue. And so now just a few brief comments about basic stem structure. What you see here is a section through a stem, and notice we see vascular bundles located in a ring around the periphery of this stem. So if we see a stem like this is a stem that probably has the potential to develop into a tree trunk at some point. So the basic question we're addressing here is, how are tree trunks constructed? So what I have here is essentially a recreation of that image that we just saw a second ago. We're looking at a cross-section through a stem. I've drawn 5 vascular bundles, and notice I've labeled each vascular bundle an X and a P. X refers to the location of the xylem cells, P the location of the phloem cells. So again, if this is a stem that has a potential to initiate secondary growth and produce woody tissue, recall earlier we mentioned the vascular cambium, right? That's one example of one of these lateral meristems. So what happens when a stem starts to initiate secondary growth and starts to grow into a woody tree trunk? Well, a line of cells within each vascular bundle between the xylem and phloem, they begin to undergo meristematic activity. So they start to undergo cell division. In addition, a line of cells between each of the vascular bundles, they too start to undergo active cell division. So now we have the formation of a vascular cambium. So this vascular cambium, again, it's a cylinder of cells found just underneath the bark of the tree. It will divide year after year after year, again, as long as the tree is alive. And the activity of that vascular cambium, of course, depends on seasonal variation. So the cambium, if you think about trees that grow in temperate regions, in the springtime the cambium kicks into gear. It starts to undergo cell division, producing lots of new cells. But in the fall, wintertime, the cambium becomes dormant and sits there until spring rolls around again, and the cambium begins to divide again. So, of course, what we can see is the activity of the vascular cambium essentially locked into place when we look at the growth rings found in tree trunks. So we're looking at here is a section through a tree trunk. At one point, the vascular cambium was way toward the bottom here. The cambium cells divided for a while, produced new woody tissue here, became dormant. Springtime rolled around, the cambium started to divide again, producing another year's growth, and again became dormant. And then finally, a third year's of growth right here. So again, what we see is a seasonal activity of the vascular cambium producing growth rings within trees. Also keep in mind, if you think about the location of xylem and phloem to begin with, recall that xylem was toward the interior, phloem was toward the exterior of the vascular cambium. And we see that same arrangement maintained within cells produced by the vascular cambium. So if this is a woody tree trunk, the vascular cambium is right here, located by the arrow, just underneath the bark. Essentially, all of the cells toward the interior of the vascular cambium, that's all xylem. The cells located toward the exterior of the vascular cambium, that's where we find the phloem. So think about that. Think about the construction of a tree trunk. Most of the tissue within that tree trunk, again, we generally call it wood, but that tends to be xylem. Where are we going to find the phloem? Well, again, it's just in a very thin region, just underneath the bark of the tree. So vascular cambium, again, is right out here. But again, just between the vascular cambium and the bark, that's where we find the phloem. So you can imagine if a person carves their initials in the tree, or if for some reason the tree gets girdled. In other words, if the bark is stripped off all the way around, that could be bad news for the tree. Why? Well, because if you remove the bark, you're also removing the phloem. If you remove the phloem, you might have sugars being produced up in the leaves, but those sugars are no longer able to make their way down to the root system. As a result, eventually the roots will die, and of course, eventually the entire tree would die.